Archbishop Desmond Tutu once famously described his country, South Africa, as the Rainbow Nation. In the 1990s, he chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a bold attempt at healing and forgiveness after the evil of apartheid. But did it really work? The spirit of those grief-filled hearings is captured in a new musical work by the South African composer Philip Miller. Our correspondent Peter Biles met him ahead of his performance in London.
Edward Joto, Edward Joto, Owako uswelekile.
The pain of South Africa's apartheid years is now part of history, but brought to life on stage. It's a complex musical interpretation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I suppose it starts really from the actual testimonies, the recordings, the testimonies themselves. And those testimonies are the seed from which everything grows. So rather than starting from perhaps a source of music as my inspiration came from the actual speeches, the testimonies that people made.
Stories of yes and 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 yes of being victimized.
It's really more fragments of moments of people speaking
about what we went through.
14 years ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began its work. Much of the evidence was deeply harrowing. Everyone was affected in some way by what they heard.
This work is, as I've mentioned, grew out of the testimonies themselves, but also from hymns and from freedom songs. And I've worked from these different genres as a basis to create this cantata. I think this work does go beyond just South Africa. It talks about really people speaking to each other and listening to each other.
This was one of the darkest moments of the TRC process, the confessions of a police torturer.
And then pull the bag over the person's head and twist it closed around the neck. In that way, cutting off the air supply.
With the testimony of Jeffrey Bazine, where he does discuss the waterboarding technique of torture that he was using. Of course, he speaks about it almost as if he's reading a recipe. But then I turn to the freedom song, Hamba Gashle Nkonto, a very famous freedom song, and I use that as a kind of dialogue with this description of evil.
The triumph of the human spirit, is that what this is all about, really?
I think it is on one level, because the TRC, even if it had its flaws, it certainly was a miraculous process that pulled us from a very divided, fractured and damaged society into a new society. So on one level, yes, it is a triumph. But it's also something about saying, don't forget what this history is and how we've got here.
Well, that's just about it from this edition of the programme. Next, we'll have the weather. But for now, from me, Jonathan Charles, and the rest of the team, goodbye.